Chapter 20. Mournful Smith, Smith of disasters, Smith who led the blind so fatefully, storm-tossed, heartbroken Smith. He stared through the windows of the house to the widowy yew trees behind which lay his idol, Lord Tom. His snow-stained, tear-stained face came but rarely out of its faraway look to survey the busy drawing-room, and only the most serious commotion could hold him for long. The coming of Mr. Leonard, together with as many of the old man's family as could get into his coach, interested him but little, and even Mr. Mansfield's proud introduction of him to the old-fashioned lawyer with his old-fashioned face, "My guardian angel, sir, a little singed and tattered, but about the wings. But then he's flown through the caves of hell. Meet Smith." Even this grand introduction provoked but a melancholy smile. "Pleased to meet you," he muttered, "I'm sure," and turned back to the viewing of his private grief. Lord Tom, you blew daylight through them just like you said. Oh, Lord Tom, you went like the grandest Toby of them all." Cowardice, boastfulness, and double-dealing had bled out of Lord Tom into the snow, and what remained in Smith's heart was the grandest Toby of them all. Then Mr. Mansfield came, and Smith turned and smiled compassionately across the room at her. She'd learned of Mr. Billings' monstrousness, and the pain and bitterness in her heart was written in her eyes. Quickly she crossed to the window, put her arm about Smith's shoulder, and pressed her cold face to his, so that her dark hair curtained them off in a private night. "Sorry you lost a friend, miss," he said. Then he turned away even from her to the dark yew trees and the strangely moving witnesses beyond. "Smith," murmured Mr. Mansfield, who had not left his side, "what did he look like?" Smith sniffed and swallowed hard. "He was a big man, Mr. Mansfield, and always wore green. Green cloak, green breeches, and he'd bright green eyes as well. He bristled a bit about the chops, but had such a smile on him when he talked of the common that he fair shone. He was a real gallant eye, Toby, Mr. Mansfield, one of the best." "He went well, Smith. None better, Mr. Mansfield. He's in heaven, Smith. If there's common up there, that's where he is, Mr. Mansfield. Right up eye on the snaffling lay." Then Mr. Leonard came over, followed by the inquisitive eyes of Mr. Field's family and the beneficiaries of nothing in particular. He began to talk in low tones to Mr. Mansfield, and Smith's mournful attention drifted away, till a piece of sardonic humour struck him, a wry Smith-like humour. Mr. Mansfield was mentioning his name and handing over the document to Mr. Leonard. With an awful smile, Smith watched the stained and tattered paper change hands. In a moment, it was done. "Bleeding mailboy, that's what I've been," he brooded. "Documents took and delivered. No charge, and you may have confidence I'll rent me an office in the shadow of Miss St. Paul's. Come wind, come snow, come Newgate jail, and the deaths of friends. Smith gets through with the documents from Curtis Court to Prickler's Hill in less than 3 months. Well done, Smith." But Mr. Leonard had come now to the trifle. Mild interest tickled Smith in spite of his aching heart. It was proposed to go at once to the burying place. Smith sighed. He had no wish to visit that spot so soon, but the beneficiaries were eager. "Come, Smith," murmured Mr. Mansfield, hearing sounds of movement to the door. "Let's see it out." So Smith, still heavy of heart, but none the less inquisitive enough not to be left behind, followed the respectfully hopeful beneficiaries to the sheeted churchyard. Strange occasion, strange procession, to go to a churchyard in hope. Through the well-remembered little gate there wound, past the rents in the snow to show where the dead man in brown and the mortality of Lord Tom had been decently dragged away. "He's gone," whispered Smith, and Mr. Mansfield took off his hat. Black and peaceful was the angel, undisturbed at its mysterious devotions though the world had rocked and tumbled about it. "Is this the place?" Andrews nodded. This was the place. The sexton was fetched from the church, and under a host of desperate eyes he began to dig. Strangely like the old man himself were the crowding beneficiaries, thought Smith, as he watched them moving their lips in silent prayer, like echoes of him. There was his nose, there his chin, and there in his frail, gaunt sister were his very eyes. Indeed, it was as though Mr. Field was come back to see his wishes at last fulfilled. Smith turned to watch the toiling sexton who'd pierced the snow and was afoot into the frozen earth. He paused to wipe his brow, hard on the beneficiaries, to wait while he drew breath. He grunted and continued. Ah, what have we here? A straining forward and excitement. No, nothing. A slab of stone. Sorry, good people. A general perishing of excitement, a gloom almost. Old Miss Field had begun to weep. Smith bowed his small, storm-tossed head. Was everyone to be disappointed? Ah, what have we here? The sexton was looking up, frowning. What had been buried, and not by him? A trifle. A wooden box. A travelling box. It was his, whispered Miss Field. I know it. He always used to take it with him to... But he's left it behind now, ma'am, grunted the sexton, and struck off the strap with his spade. It may be that it's unseemly for the beneficiaries to beam and twinkle in a churchyard, even to caper gently in the snow and crowd and shake a lawyer's hand, but in God's name, what else were there to do? Crocodiles might have wept, but the beneficiaries were needy human souls. Mr. Field's wooden box was filled, stuffed and glutted with a prosperous lifetime's guineas or coins. Guineas that lay upon guineas in sunny shoals, gleaming and twinkling in the cold light. The old man must have carried them there in bags, which had long since split and sunk under the spreading weight of coinage, for here and there tufts of canvas poked up like threads of cloud in a golden sky. 100,000, thought Smith dreamily. Must be 100,000 golden flatties down there. God save the king! For Smith, whenever he saw a sight too grand for any of his words, always said, God save the king. And some time later that morning, when the company and radiant spirits were back in the house, he had occasion to say once more, God save the king. It is night in the Red Lion Tavern between Turnmill Street and Saffron Hill. In the cellar, Miss Fanny and Miss Bridget, reduced to 4 or 5 smoking tallows, are sewing mournfully. Miss Fanny has heard of the death of her admirer and is red-eyed and sniffy. Miss Bridget does not speak but sighs and shrugs her shoulders from time to time. Their shadows hugely comment on them but upon the wall. Miss Bridget looks up as if she'll speak, but thinks better of it and returns to her work. Miss Fanny loudly sniffs again. Suddenly there are certain sounds from above. Miss Bridget frowns and shakes her head. Her great shadow does likewise, as if in agreement. But Miss Fanny puts down her work with an air of presentment. It's him, never. It's him, Brid. It's him. The door opens. There's a clatter and scuffle. Once more, Smith has missed his footing and fallen down the stairs. It's him. It's smart, cries Miss Fanny, dropping her work entirely and bustling to her feet. And about time too, says Miss Bridget, looking as stern as she might. Oh, you felonious child, we thought you were shamefully dead. Now Smith picks himself up, rubs his elbows and side of his head and a shin. He squints disparagingly around the cellar, then grandly at his sisters. Dead? He says. What business would I have being dead with 10,000 guineas to me name? Answer me that. And he stares at them with such an air of offended dignity and unnatural honesty that they're half inclined to believe him. The half so inclined is Miss Fanny. The half which is not is Miss Bridget, who's worked hard all her young life and never dreamed of being related to more than £20 in cash. Resolutely, she's ever set her handsome but toil-sterned face against her softer sister's imaginings, saying over and over again that such gaudy thoughts are as tinsel thread, fit enough to decorate a bodice, but never to hold up a hem. Tears start to her eyes as she sees her sister dote and smile foolishly upon the small Smith, whose heart she thought she knew as being closer to her own. Of a sudden, Miss Bridget feels tired and lonely in the seedy world of the Red Lion cellar. Why must it always be me, she thinks, who's got to spoil the dreaming? Do they suppose I like this shameful place, but someone must face it out, for we can't live off dreams alone. What would you say, says Smith, adding insult to injury by disengaging himself from Miss Fanny and coming to outface the stern Miss Bridget herself, to a carriage and pair and a house in the Golden Square. Miss Bridget looks at her silly sister and then thin child, whose sharp face is fairly shining with pleasure. She sighs. Why not? She thinks, what harm in a few hours of cheerful dreaming? Soon enough the grey dawn. So Miss Bridget nods and smiles and reaches out to ruffle Smith's head. I'd say, child, I'd like it very much. When do we move? Tomorrow, says Smith. And what would you say to a footman, a maid, and a coachee? I'd say, very elegant, child. When do we engage them? Is it possible Miss Bridget is beginning to enjoy the dreaming, or are her eyes shining only because she's warmed by Smith's generosity, even his dreams? Tomorrow, says Smith. Oh, smut, cries Miss Fanny, you are good. Might we have a tall coachman in green livery? Smith nods in an offhand fashion, and what would you say to me offering me old friend Mr. Magistrate Mansfield of Vine Street a lot of what might warm him against the cold night air? Miss Bridget smiles. I'd say it would be an honour, and we'd be very pleased to oblige. When do we invite him? Now, says Smith and shouts. Come in, Mr. Mansfield. I prepared him. Mind the steps. There's 13. Upon which Miss Fanny shrieks and Miss Bridget goes white as her stockings, for the door has opened and the great blind magistrate himself stands incredibly at the head of the stairs. Good evening, ladies. I've heard much about you. Very pitiable to behold is now Miss Bridget, for she's gone quite distracted and begins to fly about the cellar in a terrible frenzy of tidying and making seemly. Her thoughts are in a whirl, and she knows now not if she's on her head or on her heels. She keeps crying out breathlessly, oh, smut, you should have said, you should have warned, oh, smut, till Smith puts an end to her cellar-proud misery by saying, don't fret, Miss Bridget, he's as blind as a mole. If it wasn't for the whiff, he might as well be in St. James's Palace. Ain't that so, Mr. Mansfield? And the great man smiles and nods, and Miss Bridget is no longer in any doubt of which way up she is. She knows she is on her head. And that was how Smith came home. Smith of the courts and alleys, Smith of the corners and byways, and many a passing pocket. Smith the 10,000 guinea man. For he'd spoken not a halfpenny less than the truth. On the morning at Prickler's Hill, to the beneficiary's approval and his own speechless, save the king, delight, Attorney Leonard had awarded him 1/10 of the churchyard treasure as a mark of gratitude and esteem. 10,000 guineas! A good round sum, had said Mr. Mansfield with satisfaction. And what are you going to do with it, Smith? But Smith has answered never a word, for he'd fainted away on King. Small wonder then that Miss Bridget was distracted, and even after an hour, with the magistrate sitting beside her talking gently and wisely for all their futures, still believed she'd fallen a victim to her sister's foolish dreaming, and was no more awake than a bedpost. But at last, when morning brought no gloomy fact to dispel the night's fancy, she permitted herself to believe that the future was a rosy and splendid affair, and even to tolerate with a gracious smile her sister's favourite remark that, I always said, Brid, that there'd be some good in the document, didn't I? Though there was no more snow, the weather continued very cold until the beginning of March, when an unlooked-for warmth set in, and the sun came out in spring-like glory. Everywhere the snow, which had grown as flat, tired and grubby as an old sheet, went into little green holes. Then, swiftly, these holes spread into islands which put out fingers like children in a round dance, eager to touch their neighbours. So the green islands joined up and the whiteness shrank away till they vanished entirely. And nothing more was left of the snow but a crusty puddle or two in the vicinity of Godliman Street and Curtis Court, where Mr. Leonard the attorney has his office and sometimes works late, for he's short of a partner. Even though one night Mr. Billing came quietly and furtively back, and much shocked and amazed and a trifle uneasy, Mr. Leonard let him in after warning him that he must and would have him arrested for his monstrous villainy. Don't be too harsh on me, sir, Mr. Billing had muttered with an apologetic smile. It's this world we live in that's to blame, but believe me, sir, I've come to make amends. Mr. Leonard stared at him, and Mr. Billing promptly declared his intention of turning King's evidence. He knew where was the second murder in Brown, and for the usual consideration was prepared to give him up. The usual consideration was the sparing of his wretched life, which indeed came to pass, for though Mr. Billing's heart was as black as pitch, his plump lawyer's hands were still as clean as snow. There was nothing the justice of the law could do with him but sentence him to 3 years in Newgate Jail, of which he served a month, and then fell an odd victim. The old man, who dwelt in the fireplace, took a strong fancy to him and offered him Smith's old snoozing place, which Mr. Billing, being temporarily without friends, was very glad of, and slept there comfortably till, in one of the old man's dreadful twitchy nightmares, his head was stove in by the old man's chained wrists. Naturally, a great fuss was made, and it was strongly urged that the old man be sent to Bedlam as being a danger to himself and other prisoners, but he never went, and not for the first time, his son, to whom the state was obliged, pleaded powerfully and successfully for his father to remain in the Stone Hall. His son was Mr. Jones, the hangman, so the state could scarce refuse him. For a while, Smith and Mr. Mansfield wondered uneasily, as if this strange and violent incident would affect Miss Mansfield, considering her one-time regard for the lying attorney. But Miss Mansfield was well out of that wood, and indeed out of the wood that had shadowed most of her life. Smith, staying as he did in Vine Street, had become so much Mr. Mansfield's companion and friend that the tempestuous young lady found herself, as often as not, quite unnecessary. She was able to go out and about in the town, where, by an extraordinary coincidence, she found a likeable young gentleman from Sussex, who had been waiting for her all his life, though neither of them had suspected it at first. So Smith, despite his independence of pocket and spirit, has stayed on in Vine Street as firmly and cheerfully and contentedly as only a truly free spirit could have done. Nothing holds him but affection, and nothing feeds his affection so much as the deep understanding of his own fair situation in his blind friend's dark world. Sometimes of a late afternoon, the pair of them go out together and stroll as far as Golden Square, where Smith tells Mr. Mansfield how fine and prosperous a certain establishment is looking these days. Then they go inside it, and Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny are pleased and charmed to serve them with chocolate gin. The very idea. We are dealing now with ladies. Then they go out again, and Smith looks up at the shop sign with a grin. Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny, court dressmakers. He nudges Mr. Mansfield in the ribs. Who's to know the court they was makers for what was the criminal one at Old Bailey. And from their fine bay window, the sisters smile and wave and watch their neat small brother and his grand and gentle friend walk side by side along the square, till at last they take the corner and are lost from sight. But now the sun goes down and the air darkens. A wind sets in and clouds swing across the sky. Miss Fanny looks out somewhat sadly and dabs at her eyes with a piece of fine lace. She is thinking of Lord Tom and his glittering ways, but then she looks northward and sighs and smiles, for Lord Tom sleeps in a neat grave at the top of Highgate Hill, overlooking the Finchley Common. Nothing would have pleased him better, for from there 'tis but a ghost step to visit Bob's Inn and go a-riding the night wind, but with Turpin, Robinson and Duval, a splendid and gallant company.